This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Coming to you from places unknown, an end of the summer mega episode, forcing you out there who are not familiar with this podcast to go back in time to some of my favorites. First off, Alison Gopnik, professor of psychology, Bayesian babies. Yes, I love this woman's thinking. Next up, Denise Shull, widely known, or perhaps not widely known, the inspiration for Windy Roads in Billions. She is a performance coach. And bringing up the rear of this particular mega episode, Tim Ferriss. Do I need to introduce Tim? He's sort of known. If you don't know who he is, you've kind of missed the boat. Without further delay, let's jump right into this great mega episode. Before I jump into my guest today, I have a request, a simple little request. If you like this podcast, go to iTunes and write a review. I would most appreciate that. It kind of keeps the whole thing going, the process keeps me going. Now, I just noticed, actually, the most recent review on iTunes. It's pure gold. I'm already laughing. It's pure gold. So I'm at, 600 plus episodes, 6 Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, you name it, I've talked to. It's a lot of work since 2012. The most recent review, this is just absolutely gold. I want to get a tattoo. I have no tattoos, but I want to get a tattoo of this review. The subject heading, so bad, ranting nonsense. The review, this is brutal. This guy has issues and uses this podcast as a therapy session. Pure garbage. Oh my God, that is just absolutely awesome. Don't you know that I probably know that person, right? It's somebody in my world and they're offended by something I did, and that's their way they get back at me. Which, of course, leads me to the discussion of the mind. I mean, it doesn't really lead me to the discussion of the mind, but the most important thing today is my guest. I mean, it's funny that someone wrote a review like that, because here is the counter to that review. My guest today, Alison Gopnik. She's an American professor of psychology and affiliate professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. She's known for her work in the areas of cognitive and language development, specializing in the effect of language on thought, the development of a theory of mind, and casual learning. Definitely check her TED Talk out. Really interesting stuff. She starts her analysis, gets down to child development and looking at how we learn and we grow from the earliest months in our lives. And for those of you that might be thinking this is not your thing, trust me, Alison might have the most energy of any guest I've ever had on this show. And for someone that can make up the term Bayesian babies, which would be Thomas Bayes, Bayesian statistics, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Let's jump right in with my conversation with Alison Gopnik. Professor, I have to say, when I dig into your world, my first thought that I have, I want to be in your class. I'm 49 years of age. I want to be in your class. I was thinking, why do I want to be in her class? And you can just feel this insatiable curiosity. I want to know. For you, this goes right to the heart of your work. Try and place for me how that insatiable curiosity began for you. Look, we're going to talk about child development today. You must have had great parents.
Yeah, well, I had a very interesting childhood and very rich and wonderful childhood. But a big feature of it was that I'm actually the oldest of 6 children. I was involved and engaged with children for as long as I can remember. And I had this wonderful bohemian 1950s, early 60s childhood where my parents were actually graduate students and then young faculty, but they were basically crazy bohemians. And we had an amazingly wonderful, rich, again, slightly crazy life. I was a child actor, for example, for 5 years when I was a kid. And we went to see the opening of the Guggenheim when I was 4 and my brother was 3. We drove from Philadelphia to New York to see the opening of the Guggenheim. That was just the sort of thing that my parents thought made a lot of sense to do. So I personally had a wonderful, vivid childhood. But I think also being the oldest sister of 6 meant that I was very conscious of what the younger children were like and how interesting they were. And in some sense, how much people outside didn't appreciate how interesting and smart and just fascinating they were.
Do you have a moment in time being the oldest of 6 as a keen, obviously a keen observer, and that I'm sure you would say that translates in many ways to your current adult life, but as a keen observer from very young people at a very young age, is there a moment, was there something in observing your siblings that you can think back to that's like, wow, that's just fascinating to me. I'm in awe of that, or something that struck you early on?
Well, actually, it's funny because the moment that I can remember most vividly was that I was actually reading philosophy. So I'm an affiliate professor in philosophy, and my first degree was actually in philosophy. And when I was about 10 or 11, I read Plato's Apology with I read Plato's Phaedo, which is one of the dialogues where he talks about the fact that people would have to exist in another world, another Platonic universe before and after this life, because after all, it doesn't make any sense to think that we just have this limited existence in the world and nothing comes before and nothing comes after. And what struck me in that conversation was that it just seemed obvious to me that a way that you continued on in the world was through your children, that you had children, that you raised children, that each generation of children was going on in the world. And it was amazing to me that for these incredibly smart philosophers who I tremendously admired, like Socrates, the possibility of even thinking about children didn't even show up in that dialogue. And I can remember being very struck by the fact, like, what was wrong with these guys? Why weren't they going to the obvious answer, which was thinking about the way that children make you immortal and extend you into the future and the past? And that reaction was a reaction that has really shaped the whole rest of my career. It's been, look, here's this deep, important, interesting question. It's just obvious that children are going to be able to tell you something about it. And yet the attitude towards children for all those years, even when people were sort of abstractly interested, was that they were part of the world of women and domestic life and were part of the sort of serious intellectual philosophical universe.
I love one of the ways that you phrase this, and I had so many aha moments going through your world. Babies are like the research and development operation or arm of the human species. I mean, this is where it starts.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you actually spend time sitting and watching babies, another vivid moment that I remember was when I was in my first year of graduate school, which is a wonderful time for anyone. Andrew Maltzoff, who became a famous developmental psychologist and was a young fellow graduate student, I guess I was just turned 20. We were sitting in a field looking at a bunch of babies who were just crawling around on picnic blankets in a field the way that babies do. And we just counted up how many experiments does a baby do in the course of the 5 minutes that we were watching them. And I highly recommend this. It's a really fascinating exercise. Just take, anybody under the age of 3 and just watch them for 10 minutes and count how many things they find out about, how many things they think about, how many things they try, just in that tiny brief period of time, and then compare that to how many new ideas or new discoveries you have in the course of maybe 5 years. And the babies, it's pretty clear that the babies are finding out more about the world in 5 minutes than most of us do in 5 years. And I think that's actually a really important biological fact about who we are as humans.
I like to tell people all the time that I'm a big baby, and not like in some weak way, but really because I try every day. And I think I'm very lucky with this podcast to talk to people like yourself. It keeps me fresh. It keeps things open. It doesn't close doors. Every time I get on this show, I'm like, wow, that was amazing. I can't believe they dedicated their life to that. And then I get to pick their mind and see something really interesting that I never even considered.
Well, one of the ideas that I've been working on most recently is the idea that there's this kind of basic tension. You see it in neuroscience, you see it in computer science, you see it in technology. There's this basic tension between what people call exploration and exploitation. You're trying to solve a problem. One thing to do is to look around and try and explore as many different possible solutions as you possibly can. Another thing is to narrow in on one or two solutions and really implement them, really make them happen. And I think it's important that you need to do both. So we would not want to have a world where everyone was like a 4-year-old, for one thing, because a bunch of other people would have to be taking care of that 4-year-old. There's something to be said for these adult skills of focus and narrow attention and executive function and planning and all the things that we're very good at doing in adults, the things that the production and marketing divisions, as it were, are doing. But all of that wouldn't have nearly as much potency if we didn't also have both individual people or times in our lives or developmental periods when instead we could just be exploring. We could just be finding out new things for the hell of it. We could just be curious. Here at Berkeley, there's just a lovely new study that some of my colleagues in AI have done where they took one of these very powerful machine learning algorithms and they just gave it curiosity. They added a bit that said, okay, when you're trying to solve these problems, just go out and try and get more information for the sake of more information. And it looks as if that would be counterproductive, right? You're supposed to be solving a problem. You're not supposed to be just going around and trying to find out more about the world. But it turns out that that kind of system is actually more effective than a system that's just narrowly focused on accomplishing particular goals. And I think that's the function that preschoolers play for us. And if you sit down next to a preschooler and just watch them for a while, one of the great pleasures of developmental psychology is you can actually see that happen. You can see it unfold before your eyes.
I've got a ton of questions here. I want to dive at the child level, but I think it'd be very useful for the audience for you to give the big picture, and the term I want to use from your world and many of your peers' world, life history. And why don't you explain life history from your perspective and perhaps contrast that life history to other animals, like other primates? We're kind of very different, us humans, aren't we?
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting. If you go and you talk to evolutionary biologists, one of the ideas that they come back to again and again is the idea of life history. Life history is the way that an organism develops over its entire lifespan. So not just what's the organism like at its peak, as it were, but how long a period of childhood does it have? How long does it live? When does it reproduce? When does it become senescent? When does it die? That profile, that trajectory, turns out to be a really, really important factor in lots of arguments in evolutionary biology. And if you can imagine biologists from Alpha Centauri coming to Earth 150,000 years ago and looking at these new creatures that had just evolved, these little funny primates scurrying around on the belt and trying to figure out what's special about these creatures, what makes them distinctive, the thing that would leap out at her is, my goodness, these creatures have a really bizarre life history, because what she would have noticed is that human beings have twice as long a childhood, twice as long a period of immaturity as any of our closest relatives. So chimpanzees are producing as much food as they're consuming by the time they're 7. Even in hunter-gatherer cultures, we aren't doing that till we're 15. And, my son is 30 and we're still writing tuition checks and writing tuition and rent checks when they're 30. Now, that seems paradoxical. Why would you set up a species so that there's this long period when they're not producing anything? And worse than that, they're actually requiring all these resources from us just to keep them alive. So it's a very distinctive, striking thing about us. And if you compare us to, say, chimpanzees, to our closest primate relatives, we seem to have a lot of other adaptations designed just to deal with that long period of immaturity. So we have pair bonding. We have males and females who are close and who take care of children together. Only 5% of all mammals have pair bonding. We have what anthropologists call alloparenting, which means that we have non-biological kin who are helping to take care of babies. And we have my own personal favorite, namely grandmothers. So another really strange thing about our life history, again, very distinctive, is that we have females who are living past menopause, and we in general live to our 70s as opposed to chimps who live to their 50s. So not only do we have this long extra period early in life, we have this long extra period later in life. So all that seems very puzzling. And it's striking because when you look at lots and lots and lots of other animals, not just primates, not even just mammals, but say birds and even insects, you see this relationship between how long a childhood a species has and how smart and flexible and good at learning they are as adults. So there seems to be some connection between this life history, this long childhood, and then these very distinctive capacities that we have as adults for flexibility and learning.
That starts to get right at the heart of the matter of why I was so fascinated with your work. And you're getting at, okay, if we have this long period where young people are developing and they really can't take care of themselves, and perhaps the rest of adult society is constantly thinking, well, they're not, they're just there, they're not doing much. En contraire, they are doing quite a lot. And I would love for you to explain the expression. I find it fascinating. It dovetails right into my world, at least the Bayesian part, but Bayesian babies. These babies are doing quite a bit. And it is, you just read this for the first time, you're like, wow.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, one of the things that psychologists have said for a while, my colleague Danny Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for saying this, is people are really bad at doing probability and statistics. And it's true that adults are very bad at doing probability and statistics if you actually give them a statistical problem. But it turns out that even 8-month-olds are actually extremely good at doing probability and statistics, and they can do pretty sophisticated kinds of Bayesian inference, but they do it unconsciously. They do it without knowing that that's what they're doing. And what we've been doing in my lab over the last 15 years or so is just giving children problems to solve that from the child's perspective are just a problem like, look, here's this machine and I'm putting blocks on it and tell me how the machine works. Sometimes the machine lights up, sometimes it doesn't. What's happening? How can you make the machine work? That's a very simple, practical thing that babies and children are very excited about doing. But it turns out that with that very simple kind of setup, you can show that the children are actually doing really sophisticated kinds of analyses of the data and ways of combining the data. Some interesting experiments that we've recently done, the preschoolers are actually in some ways better at doing that than adults, in the sense that the preschoolers actually take the data more into consideration. The adults seem to be designed to rely more heavily on what they already know. It really takes a lot of new data to change an adult's mind. Whereas for the children who know less to begin with, they know less to begin with, and they also seem to be designed to really pay attention to the data that's around them. That's the thing that's most important for them. The children seem to be able to do things like use conditional probabilities to infer causal structure from the time they're 2 or 3 years old, which is, I agree, is really, really amazing. And only one of the amazing things that have come out of work in developmental psychology over the last 30 years or so.
When you say that, the ability, the conditional probability ability as a very, very young child. Now, some people might be thinking, and I made the compliment to you at the top. I said, you must have had a great parenting system, great family life. And you said you gave a great story. Some people might be thinking, well, gosh, that's only if it's not for all kids. Speak to the issue, though, of that, the economic issue, children that come from the wrong side of the tracks. They don't have all the advantages. Speak to that. It becomes it's the nature nurture issue.
One of the things that we know, and again, this kind of goes with the whole life history perspective, is that you can only have that period of exploration if you also have a protected, nurturing environment. And there's at least some evidence with non-human animals that animals who are stressed early in life, for example, seem to mature more quickly. So we're sort of forced into that adult state more quickly than animals who are nurtured. But I think it's important to say that nurturance, it means having people around you who love you and care for you. It doesn't mean having people who are putting you in, mini Harvard preschool, or it doesn't mean people who are going out and giving you flashcards. In fact, there's some interesting recent studies that suggest that when children are in a pedagogical situation where they feel as if they're being taught, that actually narrows the range of options they can consider. It actually makes them explore less. And we actually recently published a study just this year, 2017. We were curious about this. So we actually went to look at children in Head Start programs in Oakland. And we also looked at children who were growing up in low-income parts of Lima, Peru, sort of in the favelas in the suburbs of Lima. And we thought, well, maybe these children are going to have more trouble with the causal inference tasks than the children in the middle-class preschools. What we discovered was, if anything, it was just the opposite. Especially these children in Peru were doing incredibly well on these causal tests. And the children in Head Start, even though they do worse if you do a formal IQ test, for example, they do worse on executive function tests. We were sort of surprised by how good they were, as good or better than the middle-class kids at solving these kind of spontaneous learning tasks. Now, remember, from the kids' perspective, this isn't learning, it's not school, it's just here's a cool toy to play with and you're trying to figure out how it works. But I think it's important to say that the kids that we were looking at, both in Peru and in Head Start, are kids who are low income, but who have parents who care enough about them to make sure that they get into Head Start programs or into these schools in Peru. So I think it's important to say that the kids need this kind of nurturant, supportive, extended family environment, which is what they have in Peru. I think that kids are not going to do well on these things in situations of stress, violence, isolation, the situations in which very many children in America, by the way, are growing up. But it isn't as if what children need is to have the middle-class parent who's hovering over them and making sure that they, do their worksheets.
I have a side question for you about your personality, your perspective, your purpose as I listen to you. Why are you so passionate?
One thing about the kind of work that I do is that I'm with kids a lot of the time. Not actually quite as much time as I'd like, but a lot of the time. And, there are some kinds of projects, some kinds of professions where you do something because you think it's important abstractly, but you don't have an immediate sense of it being important every day. And one of the nice things about working with kids is you get to see the kids, and it hits you over the head every time you see a 3-year-old, just how smart and interesting and open to the world they actually are. And I think, one of the questions that people often ask is, well, as an adult, how can you keep this very open sense of exploration and possibility that children have? And I think actually having children, hanging out with children is a really important part of that. And I think even though we kind of give lip service to, yes, the children are our future and children are important, it's still true that, I've given talks at, for example, and it is true that if you're in a room full of people and you say that you study children, you can kind of see the glazing, yeah. At least you used to see the eyes glazing over. That's not quite so true anymore, because I think people are starting to realize just how important this early period is. But it's a bit ironic that the way they realized it was because economists started telling them that there were going to be really good returns on investment. Whereas I think for me, it was sitting in the room with 3-year-olds, it was pretty obvious.
When you open up Pandora's box and you start talking about Bayesian babies and conditional probabilities, that room full of suits and that doesn't think they want to listen might all of a sudden go, what did she just say? Hold on, I better pay attention.
Well, one of the really exciting things that's happening just at this moment is that if you look at the AI community, one of the things that people have really realized, part of the new excitement about artificial intelligence, comes because people are starting to make systems that can learn. That's been the real advances have all been in machine learning. But the people who are doing that work, I think, are starting to realize they're really bumping up against the limits of the kinds of learning that machines have done so far. And they're realizing that every 3 and 4-year-old can solve problems, can learn things that you can't get a standard, even, a wonderful deep learning algorithm with enormous amounts of data. They can't do things that every 3 and 4-year-old can do. So they're getting to be very excited about talking to cognitive development people and learning about cognitive development. I'm teaching a course this year at Berkeley called Cognitive Development for Computer Scientists. So the students, and indeed a lot of the faculty, are computer scientists who want to know, how is it that, babies and young children are the best learners that we know of in the world. If learning is going to turn out to be the key thing in AI, we should really be looking at these kids. So there's this kind of nice thing about having all these nerdy geeks guys suddenly saying, gee, babies and children, they're really cool and really interesting.
You hinted about it earlier, talking about the playground and observing babies. But let's talk about play for a moment. If you were to open up with that room and start talking about play, a lot of the suits might say, oh my gosh, I have to leave. But on the flip side, if people pay attention and start to say, hold on, let's really think about play. Let's try and put ourselves back at that point in time. One great thing about play is, Mike, you feel good. Why don't you talk about some of the bigger picture benefits there that we can learn from childhood play?
Well, play is another one of those sort of evolutionarily paradoxical phenomena, because not just humans, but all young animals play. And it's characteristic of young animals rather than older animals. And of course, the very definition of play is that play is doing a bunch of things that aren't actually going to have immediate benefits. So it seems like a kind of paradox. Why is it that for so many species, we spend so much time doing things just for fun? And the thought is that the sort of for fun is a way of getting a reward for this kind of wide-ranging exploration. The kind of paradox, which I think people are familiar with, is, sometimes if you're trying too hard to do something, that actually keeps you from doing it. And pulling back and just exploring and having fun actually makes you more effective in the long run. So it's this kind of paradox, which is to actually get things done in the long run. Often in the short run, you have to release yourself from the pressure of trying to get things done. And play seems to serve that function in the animal kingdom, and what the kinds of play that we do reflect the kinds of things that we need to do as adults. So, for example, baby rats wrestle and fight, so they do all sorts of play fighting. And the interesting thing is, if you look at, with rats, unlike children, you can actually do the experiment where you see what's the difference between the ones who get to play when they're young and the ones who don't. It isn't any one specific thing that they do, but it's how flexible and resilient they are, how good they are at changing, doing something different quickly in a new context. And that seems to be the general story. So if you just want to do one specific thing and do it well, then the best thing to do is just train a system to do that one specific thing well. But if you want to be resilient, if you want to be able to face a new problem that you've never seen before and be able to do something intelligent about it, then it turns out that playing around actually helps. There's some wonderful work by a roboticist called Hod Lipson, and he was designing a robot that had a period to begin with where it just kind of messed around. It just kind of did silly dances, basically. It played with its own body. And it turned out that the advantage of that period of play was that then if you cut off the robot's leg, it could figure out how to walk even without the leg. So a robot that was just trained to walk could be really good at walking, but if you change the situation, if you cut off a leg or you put it in a new room, it would fall apart. Whereas this robot who'd gotten the chance to play could adjust to a new circumstance, a new situation. And of course, that's what we human beings are better at doing than anything else. That's our great evolutionary niche. We're the ones who are really adapted. The way I put it sometimes is we're adapted to the unknown unknowns. The unknown unknowns, that's where we live. That's our environment. That's the environment that we do best in. And of course, there's more and more unknown unknowns as we've gone on in history.
But what's amazing is the way your work maps this out, and I get back to the Bayesian babies comment and what you're talking about, test, adjust, test, adjust. The younger we are generally, and bell curve wise, that's easier. It happens more. And then we get older and we don't test, adjust anymore. We come up with an idea and we stick with it. And if new things come into our field of vision that invalidate that direction or that idea or that hypothesis, we just keep going. We don't adjust to the new information. I don't know that I'm special in any way, but I feel like I adjust very well. And I'm constantly observing other adults that don't seem to have the ability to adjust anymore. And it always strikes me every time I see it.
Well, again, I think it's important to say, as you can probably tell from listening to me, I'm very pro 4-year-old, and I love 4-year-olds, and I love being in that wild, explore, creative side. But the truth is that there's a genuine trade-off between that and then the ability to actually get things done, to actually execute things, to actually make things happen. And to some extent, if you want to make things happen, you have to ignore a lot of distractions. You can't readjust your strategy every time there's something new. And the great challenge is, how do you go back and forth between exploring, between finding out things that are new, taking new information into account, and actually being focused enough to be able to do the thing that you want to do. One way that you could think of it is, even if you think about it from the perspective of neuroscience, it's as if there are some parts of your brain, sort of roughly speaking, the back of your brain, that is really designed to hold lots of different possibilities, lots of different possible ways of thinking about how the world is. But the trouble is when you act, you don't get to, sort of do 30% of one policy and 70% of another policy. You just have to choose one policy and follow through. I think the way that people solve this sometimes in computer science, the way neuroscience seems to have solved it, the way evolutionary biology seems to have solved it, is by having these kind of alternating periods, a period of play, exploration, being protected from the immediate environment, and then a period of taking the things that you've learned in that play and exploration and putting them to use. Or sometimes a division of labor of different people with different personalities and different strengths and weaknesses. So people who are really good at general exploration and people who are really good at actually implementing things and making things happen. If you are like me, if you're a scientist, for example, I think there's this constant, probably the hardest thing about being a scientist is this constant tension between, let's think of a really crazy high-risk idea, but wait a minute, there's 50 crazy high-risk ideas. How can I decide which is the one that I should actually turn into an experiment? And how can I decide how to balance the crazy high-risk ideas and the ones that are maybe not quite such high risk, but are more likely to succeed? That's a very hard, challenging thing to do, but I think it's the secret of being a successful scientist, being a successful innovator.
You keep bringing up 4-year-olds. And so you're forcing me as we have this conversation to think the last time that I was around a 4-year-old a lot. And it was my nephew. And so, okay, in my family, there's an assortment of nephews and nieces, all teens now. So I'm having to go back a decade in time. But now, as they're all in their teens, one of them is perhaps the best athlete in the community. And he's just exceptional. And I always hear these generalizations from adults. They're like, well, he just happens to be better, this or that. But I have a very distinct memory of when this boy was 4 years old. We would go to his brother's t-ball games or whatever. His brother's a little bit older. This one little boy who's the exceptional athlete now, at 4 years of age, I would say to him, hey, I'll give you $1 if you run around the field. It was approximately maybe 3/4 of a mile. This 4-year-old boy would run around the field perhaps 8 to 10 times during the game just to collect $1 from me. Now, what we as adults, we look back now as he's a teen and he's an exceptional athlete, and we say, oh, wow, he's just, perhaps some adults just say, well, it's just natural, whatever. And I look back to the 4-year-old time and I say, you know what? That kid had a plan. He knew what he was doing at 4 and he had a plan. Maybe he couldn't describe it. Maybe he didn't know exactly what it was, but that kid had a plan.
Well, I think there's one of the things that's interesting is you can see all of these individual differences in what kinds of things different children think are fascinating and interesting and worth exploring. And I think the secret is when you see children, the things that children get most excited about, the things that are the things that they really feel that they're exploring, that they can master, and that can be really different for different children. One of the things that's interesting, you mentioning your nephew being a teenager, one of the things that we've just started working on now is the idea that adolescence may be a kind of revived period of plasticity. So adolescence may be another time when this kind of possibility and exploration happens. And the traditional picture of adolescence has always been this very negative one. How can we keep them from getting into terrible trouble all the time? And that's a real problem. But increasingly, there's more and more evidence that adolescents are actually exploring more. And in the studies, I mentioned that we did these studies that showed that the preschoolers were actually more exploratory than the adults. Now, that was about a physical problem. That was a problem about a machine and how you put blocks on a machine to make it go. But we also did that with a social problem. Why is this person acting the way that they are? And what we discovered there was that the adolescents were actually the most flexible. So the preschoolers were very flexible. They got less flexible in school age. The adults weren't very flexible in the way they thought about why someone could do what they did. But the adolescents were. The adolescents were paying an awful lot of attention to the data rather than the priors, to put it in a Bayesian way, when the problem was about human action and social relationships. So it seems as if that might be a kind of extra burst of exploration that happens with teenagers.
I would be amiss in the limited time that I have with you still if I did not get your perspective, some greatest hits of perspectives that you might have on some issues of the day that people can perhaps relate to. Not too long ago, James Damore at Google was let go, and he had a certain perspective that he wrote down. He was let go. Could you, in a nutshell, explain his perspective and then perhaps your perspective of that perspective and how maybe we all kind of missed the real important issue in that debate?
One of the general things that happen that you come up against as a developmental psychology, one of the questions that's always seemed to be a really fundamental question is how much of anything that we do is the result of nature or nurture, or how much is it the result of genes and how much is it the result of environment. It's a very natural way of thinking about it, is to act as if, okay, there's one set of forces, nature, genes, biology, and then there's this other set of forces, nurture, parents, environment, teaching, culture. And you could kind of just treat them as if they're a vector, and you could just figure out how much of one force is coming in and how much of another force is coming to shape the way that people turn out. And then you could say, okay, well, 35% of this is nature and 65 is nurture, or however the numbers would work out. That's such a natural way of thinking about it. It's very seductive, and there are even, smart popular psychologists who talk that way. But it's totally wrong from a scientific perspective. It's one of those cases where, sort of like our everyday physics turns out to be totally wrong from the perspective of scientific physics. It isn't even, people sometimes say it's not even wrong. It's just the whole wrong way of asking the question. And that's certainly true for nature and nurture, and especially for things like the sex differences that Damore was focusing on. So even the idea that there's a male brain and a female brain, or that there's a male piece that comes from nature versus nurture, just it's the wrong categories. It's the kind of category mistake. And there are lots of examples of this. If you look at actual development, what you see is that, from the moment that there's a fertilized egg, the nature and nurture are interacting. And not only are they interacting, but they're interacting in all of these complex, nonlinear, feedback-driven kinds of ways. So it's just not a good question to ask, are women naturally more suited to tech than, naturally less suited to tech than men? That naturally just doesn't mean anything from a developmental perspective. The way I put it, Larry Summers famously got into trouble for making these kinds of arguments as an economist, and I always feel as if, my reaction to Larry Summers doing that is it's as if I went to Larry Summers and said, Larry, look, here's my idea about economics. We just need to find the right price for things. And if we just find the right price and we make sure that everyone is selling everything at the price that's the natural price for that particular commodity, then the economy will work well. Now, that's kind of not even wrong. That's just not getting the most basic things about how economics works, even though for many thousands of years, that was the natural way that people thought about economics and money. And it's kind of like that with the nature, nurture, gender, is gender, nature, or nurture kinds of disputes. It's not even the right category for thinking about the problem.
Damore put that out there, and then you hear all the reactions on assorted sides. You're saying we need to take a step back and let's think about this as a scientist, and then you're not left with such black and white answers.
I mean, it's not even just not black and white. It's that let me give you an example of one of the studies that I talked about in my column in the journal after the Damore thing came out. This is a neuroscience study. So one of the things that people talk about is, well, male brains and female brains are different. And it turns out that, in fact, there are various kinds of brain measures. And on average, you'll see a difference between men and women on these particular kinds of brain measures. And that led people to think, okay, there's a kind of naturally male brain and a naturally female brain. But it turns out that if you actually look at the correlation among those features, there isn't any correlation. So most people will score really high in the male direction on some brain parts and really high in the female direction on other brain parts. The term that neuroscientists use is that it's a kind of mosaic. There are different kinds of features, and even though when you average together large numbers of people, it might look as if there's a difference, any individual person is going to be this really complicated mosaic of different kinds of features in different brain areas. And the same thing's true about people's psychological capacities. The other thing is that there's, as we say in psychology, much more within group variance than between group variance. So there's much more difference, even if there's a little bit of difference in the overlaps. There's much more difference among different women and different men than there is between men as a group and women as a group. And again, even if you just look at the very physical fact of being biologically male or biologically female. It turns out that, you might say, well, of course, that's just determined by your genes. But it turns out actually there's a very long, complicated, bidirectional set of things that happen from the moment that you have a particular set of chromosomes to the moment that you end up with, female or male genitalia, let alone a brain that has particular characteristics. So it's taking something that's really complicated and making it simple in a way that speaks to, social categories rather than really speaks to the biology, in particular speaks to development. Another point that I think is important to make is very often people act as if something's in your brain, it must be there innately and it must be genetic. And of course, that's not true either. So even if I took a whole bunch of adult men and women and discovered that their brains were different, that's what I'd expect, given that their behaviors are different, given that their social status is different. Of course, their brains are going to be different. The question is, what happened from the time that they were a zygote that led to those differences later on?
See, what's so fun about hearing you explain that, I don't know your politics. It's not relevant to this conversation, but you are diving deep with your training, your skills, your experience, and you're laying it out there in such a way that everyone has to pay attention and say, okay, I have to consider what Allison is saying there because, perhaps I didn't know that. I have to go down that path too. And it's such a contrast to modern life where we do take things and put them into partisan silos immediately when it's just all damn complicated, isn't it?
Well, I mean, this is part of the reason why I and, other people who've been on your podcast, I think there's a real tension for scientists about when we go out into the world at large, we can't tell the whole story in all its detail and complexity in, 700 words in the Wall Street Journal or even an hour-long podcast. And I think there's a lot of back and forth about, are we oversimplifying? Can we represent the science in a really good way? But I think we're kind of, we don't have a choice. People are going to be having beliefs and making decisions based on what they think the science is, whether the scientists are conveying it properly or not. So we really have, it's not as if we don't do it, somebody else isn't going to be doing it. I think in my field of developmental psychology, that's really vivid. There's no FDA on parenting books. Anybody who wants to can go out and write a book and say, look, if you do this to your children, then they're going to come out great and go to Harvard. There's nobody to stop that except real developmental psychologists trying to say something about what the science really says.
Let's keep it at the developmental level for a moment on something relatively new, because I still recall in the summer of 1995, Netscape went public. That was kind of like the ignition switch. And now roll forward to 2018. And if I give an iPhone to a 3-year-old, their fingers start moving like freaking Mozart. Have you done work, I'm assuming you have started to investigate, what are we starting to see with the early tech in the hands of children? What are some of the big picture lessons and insights that we are learning for good and bad?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. And it's funny because this is one of the examples where everybody thinks they know what the answer to that question is, apparently including some of the big funders for Apple. Everyone is convinced that this is terrible and that screens are going to destroy children's minds and that we need to keep them away from children and so on and so forth. It's amazing how deep the conviction is given how completely missing the data is. So, and of course, if you think about it, you said yourself, right? 1995 is Netscape. The first iPhone is now 10, 11 years ago. We're scientists. It takes us 15 years to do any kind of study, let alone try to figure out what the long-term consequences of something are going to be that only happened 10 years ago. But scientists are starting to do that. And my take is, if you look at the big picture, part of what adolescents and children have always been about is about they're the ones who do the technological innovation, whether that technological innovation is putting a new design on a pot or figuring out a new way of throwing a spear or figuring out a new way of organizing your life or having a train or having a telegraph. They're the ones who are always sort of on the cutting edge of that kind of technological change. And in some sense, the function of those children is to be on the cutting edge of technological change. Now, this time may be different from all the other times, but it seems like every time that happens, the previous generation is convinced that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and whatever this thing is. For Socrates, for example, it was actually reading. He thought that reading was a really terrible idea. It was going to mean that nobody remembered anything anymore. And it was also going to mean that people would think anything written in a book, it was true. And of course, he was right. People don't remember all of Homer anymore. People do tend to think that things that are written down are true. But on balance, we feel like the advantages of having writing and reading outweigh the disadvantages. And my guess is that's what's going to happen with the new technologies as well. We'll figure out how to both deal with the positive and the negative sides of them. And the experience for the next generation of children is going to be, the children who have been doing this from the time they were 2 is going to be really different from the kind of disruptive, distracting experience that it is for us as adults. Now, I don't know that that's true. It might be that 20 years from now, we're going to discover that this is finally the technology that's destroyed us all. But one way I put it is, if you're interested in technologies that just destroy us all, worry about climate change. There's only so many things you can worry about. Climate change, yeah, really worry about that. Don't worry about your kid and his iPhone.
But it's like, I think about you think about the tech, we can say, okay, what are all the disadvantages? I could just like sum them up in my mind. I can say, okay, maybe my eyes have gotten a little worse than they would have at this age by using the screens too much. And I see some adults where they've got literally a hunchback from looking at the phones. Maybe people are taking too many selfies and there's too much of that going on. But, I think about from the research standpoint and the ability to connect with people, the puzzle-like thrust of all this technology, finding any piece of information, especially for those people that have the curiosity in them and they want to go check out Allison and find your site and start digging through your papers and look at all this work that this lady has done for decades before we got there. And it gives you a head start. That kind of thing. I don't know how any of us can say that's bad.
It's kind of interesting if you look at when printing first started, reading or printing or just about any kind of technological innovation. Printing is a really interesting one. There's a wonderful book about the French Revolution and the Ancien Regime. And it points out that when printing first became really widespread and you could have a lot of cheap printing, the first thing that happened was that the world was full of terrible scandal and libel and polemics and pornography and all the kind of rubbish that you see on the net now. That was what a lot of the first printed pamphlets were like. And it took a while for things to sort of sort themselves out and figure out a way for people to sort through this amazing new source of information. But again, I don't think anyone would look back and say, oh, printing, that was a really terrible idea. Being able to actually have books that were easy and cheap to produce, that was really awful and led to the end of civilization as we know it. And in fact, if you think about it, my own personal example is if you think about the 19th century, think about the telegraph and the train. The truth is nothing technological that we've done in the last 100 years has had the same kind of impact that the telegraph and the train did. So for thousands of years, the fastest you could go was the speed of a fast horse. And then suddenly, literally, information could travel at the speed of light. That was a gigantic transformation, and it had good effects and it had bad effects. Now we look back and we think, oh, isn't that quaint and sweet and how lovely to be riding on a train? People at the time were convinced that trains were going to completely destroy the world. In a way they did. They destroyed the world of the 18th century. And I think the new tech in some ways is going to destroy the world of the 20th century, and it's going to be up to the next generation of children to build the world of the 21st century. One way I put it is, it seems to be universally true that the day before you were born is always Eden, and the day after your children are born is Mad Max. That seems to have been true for all of history.
As we go out, let me leave with something, a great line of yours that you've used many times, which I love. And you talk about what's it like to be a baby, being in love in Paris for the first time after you've had 3 double espressos. Why don't you let the audience know how that one came to be and what you really mean when you say that? One
of the big philosophical questions that we can ask about babies, and I talk about this a lot in my second book, The Philosophical Baby, is what's it like to be a baby? What's consciousness like in babies? And again, those philosophers who didn't think very much of babies for all those years often said, well, babies don't have very much consciousness. In fact, they did operations on babies, very young babies, without anesthesia for a while because they thought that they didn't have feeling, didn't have consciousness. No, it's a really hard question to answer. How do you know that anybody has consciousness, let alone how a baby does? But I think when you actually look at the science, the neuroscience and the cognitive science, it suggests that we may have a really different kind of consciousness when we're babies. The way I like to put this is it's the difference between the kind of spotlight of consciousness we have as adults, where we pay attention to one thing and it's very vivid and everything else around you kind of goes dark. And thinking about the child's consciousness as being more like a lantern. It's more like something that's illuminating the whole world. We know that some of the chemicals in things like nicotine and caffeine seem to have the effect of leading to this broader plasticity, leading to a brain that changes more easily. And we know that putting yourself in the position of a baby, like going to a new place, has the same kind of effect. Consciousness gets to be much more vivid and intense, even if your practical ability to get through the world really gets damaged. So you put all that together, and being in a new state, in a new place, like being in Paris for the first time, and having all these changes to your neurotransmitters that are making them more open and plastic, that sounds a lot like being in Paris after you've had a bunch of double espressos. And as I point out, that is kind of a wonderful way to be. But it does mean that you tend to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning crying, which may be the way it feels to be a baby.
I implore the audience to check out, too. You've got a great TED Talk out there, I think 3 million plus views, but you get into this a little bit more where you've got an example and you dig in. I'm not going to ask you here now. People can go check it out, but you get into something with broccoli and crackers and babies. And I highly recommend people to go check that out for one of those aha moments of like, wow, that's a really cool revelation. Hey, listen, where's the best place we can send people to, Allison? I mean, they can quickly check out your Wikipedia link, and there are papers that go back a long time. You've got many, many books. You're easily found. Would you like to direct people to anywhere?
Well, if you go to my website, which is AllisonGopnik.com, that's got links to the books, and it's got links to my research papers and to some of the popular things like the Wall Street Journal columns and my writing in other places as well. That's probably the best kind of Gopnik Central, the best Gopnik Central place to start. And if you look, there's a section in there called Memoirs that has some stories about what my life was like growing up, and if you're interested in that as well. So that AllisonGopnik.com is probably the best place to start, and that will give you an idea. The other good place to start is my first book, The Scientist in the Crib, which was very much designed to be a kind of all-purpose introduction to this new world of developmental psychology. Or the most recent one, The Gardener and the Carpenter, which is really about these questions, these practical questions about how do we take all this new science, what does it tell us about being a parent, and both being individual parents and what we should think of as states and societies trying to make decisions about children. So those are both two good places to start.
So, I asked and you said, the energy, the passion from being around 4-year-olds. I'm going to have to take you at your word on that. But I have to say, you've inspired me because I like to think of myself as a pretty energetic guy. But I say to myself now, my gosh, as I move forward in the next bunch of decades, assuming I've got those decades, why not stay energized and excited, right? All this boring, placid stuff, that's no fun. You want to have the energy every morning. Do you ever wake up in a morning not excited? There is no way the person that I'm talking to right now ever wakes up and is not excited. Is that true? I
can tell you one thing. I have 3 grandchildren who are the complete joy of my life. And my one practical piece of advice to people is skip the children, just go straight to the grandchildren. I take care of them about once a week. In the morning, when those little faces show up, it's the most exciting, wonderful, great thing in the entire world. By about 9 o'clock, when they're ready to go to sleep, I am really worn out. So if you saw me at the end of a full day of engaging with a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old, there are certainly moments when all that thinking and seeing and engaging in the world can wear you out. But it's well worth it for the day of inspiration. And it is actually true that, if I think about that day versus the working faculty meeting going, filling out the forms, answering emails kinds of days, there's no question that feels like a much better day to be human on.
Allison, I appreciate you taking the time today. Great insights. I could probably pick your mind for hours, but I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks. Happy to talk to you.
Jumping into my second episode of this mega episode. What the hell? I'm using the word episode twice in a sentence? That sounds terrible. Denise Shull, I hope you enjoy. My guest today, Denise Shull. She's a decision coach and performance architect. leveraging her training in psychological science to solve the challenges of mental mistakes, confidence crises, and slumps, ranging from Olympic athletes to Wall Street traders. Her most recent book, Market Mind Games, considered one of the best of its genre. But what's so cool about Denise today? She's the real-life consultant, the inspiration for one of the most fun Wall Street shows ever seen on TV. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Denise Shull. Denise, we're going to dig into your background today, dig into your specialty. But right now, you've become quite well known for something that's damn interesting. So this Showtime show, Billions, something that I've not seen the second season, so please don't tell me anything. I have to wait to get it on iTunes or something like that. But I really enjoyed the first season, and there's a lot to unpack there. But why don't you explain how you became involved with the show? Because I believe you were offering some insights and helping to put together one of the core characters.
In the summer of 2015, I got an email from Andrew Ross Sorkin saying, hey, I'm involved in this drama, and there's an actress who plays a hedge fund performance coach. She'd love to meet you. And I was like, really? Because I hadn't heard anything about it. So, of course, I looked it up, and I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. Connected with Maggie, and then she connected me with Brian Koppelman and David Levian. We met, and I explained all kinds of war stories and how I work. At the time, they had talked to Tony Robbins, is my understanding, and I'm definitely a bit different than Tony Robbins in the way I work. And then I continued in contact with Maggie, referred her. She wanted some help. Believe it or not, she went as far as neuroscience, and I gave her some books to read that I thought were practical in terms of neuroscience.
She's playing the character Wendy Rhodes.
Yeah. Maggie Siff. I was impressed with, the depth at which she wanted to go, frankly.
Okay, so here's the operative question. How much of Denise shows up on screen?
I feel like a fair amount.
Really? Explain. Give me some details. This is so much fun. Give me the grist.
Well, so for example, episode 11, I think it was last year, Magical Thinking. I was watching it with some people and not knowing, and they turned to me and they're like, oh my gosh, that's like you. And this is the one where she and Axe are working late in the evening after he's had the bad trade, and they end up talking about his feeling guilty, other emotions from other situations that were influencing his trading decision. And then I got an email from a former client in Australia that I hadn't talked to in 3 or 4 years saying, I just watched this and that was so Shull.
Well, what's cool about that is I would think many people that dedicate their lives to professions become quite proficient. Perhaps they get asked to consult, and then the finished product goes off in a direction where perhaps that original consultant is like, oh my gosh, why did I ever talk to them? But you seem pretty positive about it.
Yeah. I think in her professional work, this won't be giving away anything, but there's an episode this year where she says, what feelings do you have? Or what are you feeling? I would say, what feelings do you have? But she says, what are you feeling about that? I think, to be exact. That's how I work. It's kind of fun, really.
Let's start to unpack this some, because I really enjoyed the show, and I enjoyed it from having grown up in the DC area. The political side, the government side rang really, really true as well.
Right.
For my trading side, though, I don't have any experience with the X character. I have experience, and we can talk about this and perhaps delineate some today, but I have experience with folks more in the automated side of things, not the high frequency shops, but more of the long-term trend following shops where generally over the last 20 or 30 years, they've become pretty damn systematic. And even a guy like Ray Dalio will say he is generally at the systematic place. But the X character, well, that begs the question also to someone like you. And of course, you have with your background and your clients, you can only tell us so much, and I won't attempt to pry any more than I can. But I of course, when I see the Axe character, I know that you consulted. I can only imagine that you have consulted with and trained the types of traders that we would see in Billions. Is that fair?
It's fair to say that I have consulted with a wide variety of traders and portfolio managers. And when I say wide variety, I'm referring to their personalities and their quirks, but that also covers their, styles and their amount of money under management. I feel like I have been, privileged to realize some common characteristics. Yeah. At the end of the day, everyone's human.
While we're still in the beginning here, talking a little Billions, have you seen anything up close and personal that resembles the Axe character in some way or another?
What qualifies as up close and personal? I mean,
look, I know I can only get you in so many. So when I try to get some of these things, I know I can only push too hard. But you know what look, I think people watch that. And look, from my world, if I kind of look at it from a kind of a trend following automated perspective, if you were to walk into the office of that particular type of trader, you're not going to see the screen time, the typical Wall Street floor, the more kind of instinctive or perhaps the need for that screen time all during the day, because their situations are thought through in advance. They're price-based traders, and they don't need that. But on the flip side, when I look through your work, clearly there's a difference here. I'd love for you to kind of delineate for the audience how you yourself, when you're walking into the room and you're dealing with such different styles, how do you start the process of assisting? Because as you just said, we're all humans. So it doesn't make a difference what your style is. There might be different advice or performance help that you can give, but it's we're still human.
The way I work is, and it doesn't matter, who I'm sitting across from or who I'm on the phone with, is I am trying to understand the sequence of feelings the person is experiencing in the decisions they're making, and what are the patterns of the sequences of feelings. At first, I'm just trying to get that for myself as step one, to help them be able to realize all of their feelings and all of the sequences of feelings, because we've all been taught to be analytical, and we've all been educated to be analytical. It's what we believe, and I mean analytical in a mathematical, probabilistic, logical, and if you could see me right now, you'd see I'm doing quotes with my fingers, way. While what we know about the brain is being completely upended, like World Economic Forum is writing about, like, maybe all the brain research is wrong, and a woman that I'm close to and a big fan of her work is writing the same thing. So it may be that everything we think about our thinking is just wrong, but I've known that everything we think about our thinking is wrong from the perspective of how much feeling and emotion is actually in our perception, judgment, and decision making. I'm always looking for that dimension, feelings and emotions, that the person usually doesn't know they have, doesn't know is repetitive, certainly doesn't know where it comes from or what it means. Then by helping the person be able to look at their feelings as data, they start to be able to see, wait a minute, I had these other dimensions influencing my perception and judgment. So, back to Wendy in episode 11, that's what she was doing with Axe after he made, I can't remember the details of it, but there was a seriously bad trade where they lost a seriously lot of money. She was basically helping him understand that it had to do with guilt and some other feelings. Helping people get accurate, actually, about what's going into their perception and judgment, really, it starts to remove roadblocks that they didn't maybe knew they had, but certainly didn't understand.
Let me follow up there with the Axe example. I don't remember the exact episode either, but let's just go with where you just went. He basically let the loss get too big.
Right.
I hear what you're saying. Could one say, well, hold on, that was just bad technique, not having the loss mitigation stop process set in place? Could someone push back and say, well, hold on, one can always have the feelings, and we're all human, but is that just bad technique on his end?
Well, see, that's what everyone says. The conventional wisdom is exactly that. It's bad technique, and you solve it through, improving your processes, improving your rules, following them. What happens, though, is that never completely solves them. People make the same kind of mistakes over and over. This I can tell you. Everyone that I've worked with, and this is part of being human, but I mean, it's also part of portfolio management training. Everyone has an Achilles heel. They have that market situation where they make the same mistake. And most people attempt to put process and techniques in place. Now, granted, my clients are, sort of self-selecting in a way. Maybe there's somebody out there that I haven't met, but basically what happens is people say, and I did it again. And that's when I get them, like, why did I do this again? Well, why you did it again is this dimension of feeling and emotion that you think you're supposed to set aside. You're trying to set aside when in fact you need to make overt, conscious, analyze it as a motivator so that you can both understand a feeling or emotion that's driving you to make that same mistake that appears as an Achilles heel, but also so you can start to be more aware of intuitive feelings that are really unconscious pattern recognition. Technique is the standard answer, but I can tell you this for sure. It doesn't usually solve the problem. I mean, it may mitigate the problem, but inevitably people will make the same kind of mistake again.
What's the aha moment that people have with you when you were able to get them to think about that feeling, and I guess thinking of it as a piece of data, getting them over that hump to where they're no longer, it's not holding them captive?
Honestly, I was going to say Wendy and Billions didn't quite go here, but honestly, it goes something like this. I am rationalizing getting bigger in this position because it seems like, if I liked it at 20, I love it at 15 kind of thing. And we had this long-term analysis. But really, they realize it's about proving that they're smarter than the next guy. And it's about, or something else, but proving they're smarter is a common one. Proving they're smart enough to, frankly, many men to their father, since you ask. But what I'm really saying there is the aha moment is I realize I've had this situation in the markets multiple times. I realize that I have this set of feelings that drive that. And oh my gosh, I realize that set of feelings is the same set of feelings I had when I was ninth grader and I got cut from the football team. And frankly, fill in the blank 4-letter word. I'm doing this and it almost has nothing to do with this market decision. It has to do with these feelings related to my self-image and who I am and proving who I am that I can remember from growing up. And then people are like, oh my gosh. And then, well, that ought to be easy to solve because I start to see how that's not related to this. But the clue, the power, the leverage is in recognizing you have this set of feelings and it's something in your personality development that has nothing to do with the market decision. But as you get conscious of where the source of those feelings, then it's a lot easier to pull that spaghetti bowl apart. It doesn't solve the feelings, the self-image feelings necessarily at first, but it does start to detach them from the market decision.
I want to dig into a lot of different perspectives that you can offer the audience, but I think it would be fun to go back in time a little bit. I'm looking at a title of your thesis research, The Neurobiology of Freud's Repetition Compulsion. So I think it would be interesting for the audience, as you're offering these great insights, to give them a perspective as to how you developed, because you had to go down a path to get to the point where you can help people. Even before, I'm going to let you explain that thesis title and perhaps to us mere mortals, bring us into where your work went with that thesis research. But perhaps even before that, what was the trigger for you as a young person that you went down this path? Was there any one aha moment, a mentor, something where you said, my gosh, the study of the mind, the human condition, behavior, this is where I'm going. I can't be stopped?
First, I got to say, wow, I'm impressed, because I've been interviewed, scores of times, and no one's ever asked me about that paper or how that came to be.
I try. I'm 500 episodes in. I'm working at this,
Yeah. No, I'm seriously impressed and happy, actually. Now, of course, in my mind, I'm sort of like, well, where do I start? Because sometimes,
exactly.
Honestly, Michael, I feel like my whole life, and I mean my whole life, has contributed to me being in this position where I seem to have figured out this thing related to feelings and emotions and performance.
What's the first age where you knew you were observing the human condition in such a way that you felt different, or you felt like inside you felt like you had something? I mean, were you really, really young? When did that, is there any kind of like early memory where that starts for you?
There's performance evidence that it started way before I knew it. I was an only child. I was also adopted at 4 months old. I was unusually mature. Like my teachers would always say, I seemed older than I was. And I could always win these contests at like amusement parks. I grew up in Ohio, and at Cedar Park, I could always get, the guys to say I was 14 when I was 12 or 12 when I was 10 or whatever. It was usually 3 years. They usually thought I was 3 years older. Then I worked at a summer camp, honestly, and I was 16. They put me in a senior counselor position, and you were supposed to be in college. And then they brought the children's home kids out for a week, and they brought me into the office, and they said, okay, this is going to be kind of weird, but we want to give you the senior high school girls, and some of them are older than you. I was like, what? So I was very honest. Like, I'm still kind of honest to a fault. And this was a Christian camp. So, we were definitely like ethics was a big deal. But I basically made the decision that I was going to lie and say I was 19, because I wasn't telling these girls that grew up in a children's home that they were 2 years older than me. But we had a fabulously successful week. And it's just a point where I seem to have some understanding of human nature that honestly I think came from partially growing up as an only child with a mother who, fair to say, was somewhat self-absorbed. So I had a lot of time to sort of think. I didn't have 5 brothers and sisters. Like everyone else in my neighborhood was Catholic, these big families. And so there was and I was an early riser. Like I just had lots of time to be introspective. And I somehow think that led me to the position where people considered me more mature, or, I get children's home girls that are 2 and 3 years older than me in my cabin. But when I first really recognized that there was something to be studied and something to be figured out was like my mid to late 20s. I started noticing that all of my friends would get in these relationships, and some were marriages, and these relationships would break up. And then they would get in another relationship, and the people involved would be completely different, but the scenarios would be exactly the same. And I was like, that's bizarre. That's just bizarre. And I actually, at the time, worked for IBM. IBM had a great benefits program. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to go to therapy, like as a lark, and see what I can learn. Like, IBM will pay for it. What the heck? And I go to this woman. It was in Cleveland, Ohio at the time. Her name was Joan Rich. And like I was dating this guy. And one day she says to me, well, how do you think he feels about you? And I say, well, blah, 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 blah. And she's like, well, it might have gone the other way around. I never remember which way these questions went. But then she's like, well, how do you think your father really feels about you? And I started to say, blah, blah. And I realized the identical words were about to come out of my mouth. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. There's a phenomenon where you think your romantic partner is the same as your parent. And like the light bulb went on. Lo and behold, I found out that Freud had identified this in 1889 or, some year to that effect. I don't know the exact year. And called it the repetition compulsion. And he has this beautiful paragraph that describes how people get in similar situations while they look completely different, and he's actually referring mainly to work situations in this paragraph, but in the end, they always end the exact same way for the exact same reasons. So I was like, that seems to be true. And I was a biology undergraduate. I'd always been really interested in what makes us tick. And again, I'll go back to that, like, lots of alone introspective time as an only child. So I was like, well, if we do that, if we unconsciously get ourselves in similar situations or recreate a situation, contribute to a situation such that it recreates a feeling, then there's got to be a template in our brain. I was actually supposed to go to Stanford Business School while I was still at IBM. I thought to myself, I don't know if I want to be doing the MBA, computer, rising the corporate ladder thing. I think I'm going to leave IBM, and this was back when it was still a great job and no one ever left IBM, and go to graduate school in psychology. And I found out that University of Chicago had this basically design your own master's program where you don't have to take 2, research level classes and then get a professor to sponsor you for research. So that's what I did. And there you have. It really should be the neurobiology of Freud's theory of the repetition compulsion. But no one ever pointed that out or realized that until just a few years ago.
What was you just mentioned one of the kind of the with your partner and kind of mimicking or perhaps connecting with parents, but what was some of the other research that came through that? What was some of the other insights that because that started to lay the foundation for where you've come up to today? Yeah,
totally. So I'm not sure if you're referring to the master's thesis or to the actual experiences of repetition.
The thesis, yeah.
At that point, it was called biopsychology. And I really had to do, what my advisor ended up calling like the best literature review she'd ever seen. I literally went to the library and tried to find articles on child development related to emotions and I was really trying to look for the unconscious because we're not conscious. We're getting ourselves in the same situation or marrying the same person again or, having the same argument with our boss. We're not conscious that we're creating this. So, but there was very, very little written. So I had to, and there's still, honestly, that paper, for what it's worth, I was sitting at a conference in New York a couple of years ago, a Saturday conference, and the society, what's it called? The president of the Neuropsychoanalytic Society was giving the keynote. And she said, let me give you a history of neuropsychoanalysis. And she says, one of the first 2 or 3 papers ever written in this field, and she has my paper on the list. Michael, I almost fell off the chair. I was like, first of all, I didn't know anyone knew about this paper, and I certainly wasn't expecting anyone to. So there's most people have heard of attachment theory, which is, how an infant ends up attaching to its caregiver, and they've been qualified as these different styles of organized attachment and disorganized attachment. But I was like, okay, there's something going on there when a baby is born and how they're starting to recognize that they're separate from their mother or the person taking care of them. There's also a phenomenon called critical periods. And so it's most easily seen in birds or understood in birds. There's lots of birds, if they don't hear their characteristic song during a specific point when they're babies, they'll never be able to sing it. I'm not sure sing is the right word for birds. And so I was like, wow, I think there's a critical period for attachment and self-image as you ultimately unconsciously, assume what your relationship is to other important figures. Basically, then I started to walk through the biology of child development as to how that could get set up so that, years later, any one of us is acting and reacting in relationship to important figures, whether that's spouses or bosses or the police or the market, because that's what I figured out way later. And we're reacting out of this template that was built, in the first 2-3 years of our existence.
That's a tough insight, though, because if people, don't have a great first 2 to 3 years, but, they continue on, they grow, they get older, and then you have a population as a whole, and some of that population had a great 2 to 3 years, some of it didn't. But then as adults, we're all there standing in the pit together, so to speak, debating, arguing, trying to move forward. And it can be very difficult if some folks have had that great early start versus some folks not having it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it isn't to say that people they can't mitigate if they had a bad first, early life, that they can't mitigate it. It also isn't to say, I mean, people develop coping mechanisms or sometimes defense mechanisms that oftentimes serve them. So, for example, a common one with children is if things are really difficult, and the child then feels, of course, powerless because the child is powerless. One coping mechanism that people develop is blaming themselves, because actually, if you think about it, if you blame yourself for something, it actually gives you the feeling that you might have some control over it. Blaming yourself, though, can ultimately at least superficially and practically to an extent, be helpful because it can make you work harder, try harder, make you more responsible. What I'm saying is the way people react to maybe suboptimal attachment and self-image doesn't necessarily turn out to be negative. Now, having said that, though, at the worst moment, when provoked or when challenged, extensively by the market, you might see some sort of patterned reaction that could be untangled if you could connect it to the person's feelings about who they are and what their place in the world is and how they relate to people or situations of authority.
Let me bring you to the markets. How did you enter? You're going down this one path, and it doesn't sound like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't sound like you were going down the markets and money path and billions,
No.
So what was the trigger? What was the crossover for you?
Well, I was in Chicago, going to the University of Chicago and working out at East Bank Club in Chicago, and I played beach volleyball with a group of people, and a couple of them were floor traders at the SIBO.
Hold on. I hope people are making notes right now that if you want to end up at some point in time for the next Wall Street series that will appear on a cable channel, you start at the beach volleyball right? I mean, this is life. Life is great, huh? Continue. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. So one of my friends in that volleyball group said to me at one point, he'd said to me, I think, I was fascinated by his trading. For one thing, I was fascinated by his trading. And I would ask him questions about you go down there in the morning, and you make $10,000 and you come home at 2:00. How does this work? And he had sort of teased me, well, you should come down there. And I'm like, not a chance. And then the SIBA or Board of Trade introduced a weather futures seat. And he tried really hard to get me to buy I say weather futures seat because I was like, what the heck is that? This makes no sense to me. Now, probably related is my father was a very consistent investor. He literally never sold a share of stock, but he consistently bought stock and tracked the market, as did my grandmother, even though she had been single, unmarried. She divorced her husband in 1932 in the middle of the Depression with 2 young kids. But anyway, so I had this kind of point being I had a family that paid attention to the market. So there was some sort of sometimes I feel like I ended up in the family business, even though we didn't really have one. But anyway, so Mr. Weather Futures seat, when I was finally writing my master's thesis, he was approached in the summer of 1994 to go upstairs in one of the first upstairs trading firms, meaning trading on screen. But of course, you didn't get intraday P&L. And he and his buddy, who were going to one of these first prop firms, so to speak, said, okay, we'll make you a deal. If you come, while you're just writing that silly master's thesis of yours and thinking about whether you're going to get your PhD or not, how about you come keep track of our P&L intraday and we'll teach you to trade? And I was like, oh, all right, this sounds interesting. And sure enough, within a few months, I had actually joined the firm as myself and stopped keeping track of their P&L intraday. and learned to trade from someone named Bob Cantor, who had actually come to Chicago from New York to start this prop firm. Then I went to Schoenfeld for a little bit to learn momentum trading. And my PhD obviously went by the wayside. And I just started reading, Mark Douglas, Brett Steenbarger, Alexander Elder, all the trading psychology out there. And Market Wizards, I can remember going home on Friday night and saying, I don't need to go out and party with you guys. I'd just rather go home and read this book and have a glass of wine on my couch. So I was totally fascinated by the psychology side of it. In that first prop firm, we had all sorts of different styles, from really short-term momentum to scalping utilities to relatively long-term illiquid stocks. And I was trying to figure out what is this? And how are you successful in this? And how do these guys take these different approaches? And truthfully, I didn't understand it. And it seemed like that interesting, fun master's thesis was just this expensive diversion that I had, and it was never going to be anything more than this expensive diversion that I had.
I don't say it as a sad note, because I had pleasant conversations with him, but I tried for years to have Mark Douglas on this show, and he finally had finished his newest work and had committed, and then unfortunately passed away. I was so disappointed. He was so particular in the sense that he didn't want to come out before he was ready, and I kept trying, but
I sat down with him in 2005. I actually hired him when I was trading. And I later actually hired Ari Keefe too, when I came to New York to run a trading desk. But I got back in touch with Mark when people started to ask me to coach after my first few articles and my first few talks. And frankly, then I was studying in a psychoanalytic institute in the evening when people first started asking me to coach based on these articles. But in any event, I sat down. I had the opportunity to see Mark in Las Vegas and sat down with him, and to hear him talk about the blood, sweat, and tears that he put into those books. I mean, he and I, if he were alive today, we wouldn't agree on everything, but I had such respect for him because it meant so much to him to get it right. And I feel like part of the difference is that I just had the advantage of having more neuroscience. Maybe I had the advantage of being able to have insight that wasn't available when he was first writing.
Let me tear that apart a little, because we've talked a few names here, and you've drawn some lines, and you mentioned Anthony Robbins earlier. I would share an experience that I had right around 1994. I had picked up Anthony Robbins' Unlimited Power. I did not read the whole thing, I don't think, but I read the part about Steven Spielberg going to the Universal lot, and that motivated me to ultimately, around that time period, 1994, to literally go knock on the doors of the Market Wizards that we were just talking about for that particular book. And it was that he kind of gave me permission that was okay. So I know Anthony Robbins does quite a few things, but for me, that one little particular piece of insight, to go find the best and try and model the best was very clever advice. I don't really know a lot of people that do that I talk to. I still think it's great advice for me in particular.
Yeah. I think it's great advice too. It seems like it's sort of funny that it is not more obvious to people. Exactly.
We grow up with the idea of, frankly, go to school, memorize a bunch of stuff, get a job, die.
Right. Exactly. We do. That's crazy.
Let me pick though a little bit more in the sense that I won't name any names because a lot of folks have appeared on my show. But if you want to kind of draw some differences for people to think about in a kind of an intellectual way, you're welcome to. But there are quite a few people that have kind of, for lack of a better term, let's just say trading psychology or trading coach. There's quite a few people that members of my audience will recognize, and other names, including your name, of course. But talk about perhaps comparing yourself and contrasting, and perhaps you just mentioned Mark Douglas, where you see yourself that you have gone in a different way, or perhaps you might think it's the better way.
Well, I do. That's fair. Truthfully, I think first of all, you've got to step back and recognize the mental problem of markets, which is relentless uncertainty. And, no one knows what's going to happen this afternoon. And that's a specific type of problem to the brain, where it particularly draws on context to try to fill in the pieces of what's the right decision to make. And specifically drawing on context, it definitely draws on the person's feelings, even though an analytical, logically trained person might not realize it. I bring this neuroscience that shows, for example, you have to have emotion to make a decision. And that master's thesis, by the way, was republished in 2003 in a psychoanalytic journal, and I updated it because it had been originally written in 94, 95. And that's when researchers had shown you had to have emotion to make a decision. And I was like, well, darn, so much of this trading psychology is wrong because you can't, if you took the emotion out of it completely, you wouldn't be able to make a decision. In the subsequent 12 or 13 years, the role of what an academic will call affect, which is like the difference between before or after you've had coffee or before or after you've had a cocktail, sort of mood, optimism, and emotion, which is a specific, intense form of that, which also includes conviction, by the way. I've had this conversation with many people in the trading hedge fund space, and I feel perfectly justified in saying conviction is an emotion because it's an intense physical experience. My work focuses on that dimension and on making it respectable, making it data, understanding it, pulling apart as the most important job. Now, having said that, you have to have, I couldn't take somebody and make them, aware of all of their feelings and emotions and not have the training to be a trader or portfolio manager. I'm not saying it's the most important job without having, courses 101 through 401. But it's the key when you want to seriously improve your performance or fix what is otherwise an unsolvable problem.
Let me get you to pause for 1 second and let the audience come into your world. Conviction as data. I agree. Without having your training, there's a different, when you have that conviction deep in your core, there is an entirely different feeling. I mean, from the biology to the brain, everything is just in alignment. It's like, wow, go time. But talk about conviction as data and how that would be better understood for the audience.
Well, so for example, like an exercise we just did with a hedge fund that we're working with, is we got them to do a 7-point scale as to levels of confidence, which I think is slightly different than conviction, but for all practical purposes, we can use them for the same as this. Like there's, varying levels of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, let's just say. For them to be able to decide jointly among the analysts and PMs on a scale they're going to use to describe their varying levels of fear, uncertainty, and doubt on the road to confidence and conviction, develop a language around the words of doubt or concern or panic or anxiety, and start to fold the question and the usage of those words into their analysis and into their conversations. So like one of the analysts ended up saying, he said, every time we do risk reward, we have to also say where we are on our 7-point confidence spectrum, because it's like the sum total of everything. And we need to track how it changes, because basically let's say you're confident and then you become somewhat concerned. First of all, you need to recognize that your state has changed, because somewhere your unconscious pattern recognition is telling you there's something that needs looked at or analyzed. And if you then are explicit about it and you can say to your colleagues, I'm moving from concerned to nervous, then you can help each other ask questions about, okay, what piece of data or what event did change where you are in that spectrum, and what do we need to do to either resolve it or to dig deeper into it in order to resolve it, or if we dig deeper into it, what does it say about being in the position or position sizing?
Can I think of it this way? A volatility measure like ATR, okay, there's a number. Conviction as a number, instead of letting conviction be a feeling that's bouncing around in the 6 inches between our ears. You want to get it out of just that internal process and get it to something where we can kind of look at it and measure it.
Absolutely. That's exactly it.
Well, then I'm a good student today.
or I'm so deep in the weeds that I forget to make it accessible.
Well, no, I think it's just.
I mean, not that you're not a good student.
No, I just, just trying to bring it out and say it in a different way and make sure everyone's following along. I mean, I kind of get instinctively where you're going. It is kind of, for me, even it's an aha moment of like, okay, wow, everyone listening, whether they're trading or not, could start to think of, and of course they can go follow your work and read your book, look at your research papers, but the idea of taking what's inside, the feelings inside, and taking more control of them, and I mean, not control to try and make them go away, but to at least to analyze them in terms of where are they on the spectrum? Are they cold or are they hot?
To use them. I mean, okay, technically in science, you can't prove anything, but like we're pretty sure the sun rises in the east. The point being, like, I'm really sure that from a brain perception judgment point of view, what you feel, and that can be just as simple as, can you feel your heart rate, to you feel extreme anxiety or frustration or conviction, and wherever you are on that continuum, there is information in there. Basically, none of us have been taught to think about it that way, and we certainly haven't been taught to look at it and analyze it in any way. And I can tell you, those people who do, there's alpha in it, there's market performance in it, there are fewer bad decisions because you end up being able to mitigate working out your personality in the market. And that actually opens you up also to better instinct, intuitive feelings. And that reminds me of something I wanted to say. A moment ago, you said something like, you got this instinctively. I can tell you and I would not be sitting here if it weren't for 2003, 4, 5, 6, when I first started being invited to write or speak about it. And, lots of people in the audience saying, oh my gosh, like I finally make sense to myself. I thought it was just me. Like, I didn't want to tell anybody that I was like, that my feelings and emotions either got in my way or they helped me in some way. And I didn't understand why, like, all the conventional sort of cognitive behavioral stuff, I thought it was like my failing. But what you said makes so much sense to me. So I feel like I only ended up here because I was in this crazy situation where I had an interest in some information, and maybe like even being an only child who was adopted, like I didn't have such a strong family culture that I was able to be a little bit more iconoclastic and a little bit more of a rebel, so that I could say, hey, wait a minute, guys, like, the emperor has no clothes. This view on emotion is wrong from a brain point of view and from a practical point of view. And when I talk about it, so many people say, yeah, it resonates and it makes sense to them.
I have one big topic area, which is kind of somewhat in the same topic area where we've been going. But I want to introduce a character that some people will know and some people will not know. But I think you can kind of tell a little bit of his story, and that would be Benoit Mandelbrot and the idea of fractal emotions. You might first want to put your professorial hat on and explain fractals, but then also fractal emotions.
When I first started coaching, I didn't realize that my, psychoanalytic repetition compulsion background was going to come into direct play. But I would say, I had my first clients in 2003. By sometime 2006, I can remember one client. It was so obvious that they were repeating their life story in the problems they had in the market. Which, by the way, the guy he was trading on the floor, CVOT, made a bunch of money every morning. Forgive me, the other way around. Lost a bunch of money every morning, but would always make it back. And was making good money, but basically called me up and said, if I didn't start out the day down like 25 grand, in the pit, he goes, I wouldn't have to I'd be making twice as much money. Why is this? And it turns out he was born to a mother on welfare. He had this sort of rags to riches story. And we kind of figured out he was just repeating his whole life in everyday's trading. And once we unraveled that, he stopped doing that. But fractal emotions. So by the time it came to write my book, and I was trying to think more and more deeply about this and how to describe it, I had come across the concept of fractal, which is patterns repeated on different scales. And the easiest way for people to think about that are stalks of broccoli or tree branches, where, one little small piece of broccoli really looks the same as the whole head of broccoli. It's just a different size. And one little set of tree branches kind of looks the same as the whole tree, just a different size, or to use the technical term, scale. I studied fractals from a market price, repetition point of view. And I learned that Mandelbrot was basically the founder of, or the person who originally recognized them. I mean, there's some argument about that, but basically Mandelbrot. And it just hit me. I was reading some of Mandelbrot's work when I was writing my book, and I was like, wait a minute, that's what these repetitive emotions are. It's the same. You have this little pattern like you have in the little tiny piece of broccoli, and it gets, reapplied at a different scale in a different situation, but the core pattern is there. I honestly believe that what Freud called the compulsion to repeat, what I will tend to call repetitive emotions, that they are fractal, just in the same way broccoli is or a tree is. Now, I think in a human being, it's an opportunity to optimize. Like part of it happens because you learned it, but it also gives you an opportunity. The discomfort of it gives you an opportunity to say, okay, what do I want to untangle about this pattern?
I find Mandelbrot a fascinating guy, and I'm kind of late to the party on him too. And in fact, I would be curious your view, for example, when it comes to markets and money. He was one of the first to be saying, this efficient market hypothesis might have some holes in it.
Yeah.
What your perspective there on his perspective?
Well, clearly the efficient market has some holes in it.
But you say clearly, hold on. There's a lot of people at the University of Chicago that might say, hold on, Denise, we don't think so.
But there's a lot of people at the University of Chicago who would also agree with me. That's a big thing at the University of Chicago. The efficient markets crowd versus the behavioral finance crowd.
Yes, with Dick Thaler and whatnot.
Yeah. And if you're in the business school, you're sort of, whose camp are you in?
For me, I look at it and I say, hold on. The efficient market hypothesis theory, when they attempt to explain October of 2008, it just falls down. I
think it falls down like a lot of the time. It's helpful. Like if you're going to research something, you have to put some stake in the ground and have some cornerstone to work with, which in a lot of ways is what the efficient markets hypothesis is. But then at the end of the day, you got to say, okay, my research sprung from this foundation, but this foundation also cast these questions as to the results, and that has to be reconciled. And in a way, Harry Markowitz of, what's his paper?
The one that won the Nobel Prize.
The one that won the Nobel Prize, yeah.
I don't remember the name exactly either.
Yeah.
And I'm friends with Harry.
Yeah. Well, you could ask him, but he will tell you, and it's very clear to see, and I have this in a lot of my presentations, it might even be in my book. The very first paragraph of his paper says, figuring out what you believe is step one. Then figuring out how to apply it is step two. Allocating assets based on what you believe is step one, or step two. Confused myself. The net of it is, Markowitz says that you have to figure out what you believe is step one, and the paper does not cover step one. He says this paper starts at step two, and I'm not qualified to speak about step one. And then at the end of the paper, he says 3 or 4 times, remember to go back and try to understand step one. This paper's focused on step two.
I don't think he really likes the idea that his work was, and I'm paraphrasing a little here, his work was taken into a certain direction, which is essentially now, people out on Wall Street will say, well, Harry Markowitz's work, this is the foundation of everyone should be in a passive index and nothing more.
Right.
I don't think he concurs there at all.
Yeah, I can totally believe that. Yeah.
Yeah. I have to tell you something funny. When I interviewed him for my film years back, and then a documentary film. And then I had him on the podcast a few years ago too. And it was so great. I don't know how old he is today. I should Google it, but he's over 90, I believe.
Yeah.
But it's so fabulous. I call him up on the phone and, he answers the phone. It's like, and you can hear this in the podcast. It's like, hello, this is Harry Markowitz. You're just he sounds like he's 16.
Yeah. Oh, really? Oh, that's great. I'm so glad to hear that.
I mean, things will change. Of course, it changes for us all. But I don't think I've ever heard someone that pepper over the age of 90. So fabulous.
I love that. That's inspiration.
Yeah. Hey, so Denise, let me. I can't keep you, but I do want people to check out your work. Market Mind Games: A Radical Psychology of Investing, Trading, and Risk. It has been out for a few years, but people should check that out. Where else can we send people to check in on you and your world?
Well, I haven't had any time to update my blog in months now, but I do have a blog on the rethinkgroup.net. I do have a newsletter that I also haven't had any time to write. Last one I wrote was during the World Series last year, but I'm committed to fixing that over the summer.
Basically, if people want you, they have to really want you, and they have to come find you somehow or another, and then they might get a hold of you. Something like that?
Well, we do try to answer all the contact us requests that we get. I did literally just yesterday hire an assistant. Hopefully it will get better. We have, we've also taken on some athletes. We're working with the U.S. Olympic border cross team, which is snowboard racing. That's contributed to the backlog is on our to-do list. And that's a whole different conversation, how trading psychology, sports psychology does not apply to trading psychology in many ways. Basically, the short version of that is that you can make something happen in sports, and in the market, you have to sit back and interact with it more like sailing or surfing. And that creates two totally different mental problems and two totally different set of feelings that you need to understand.
I watched the last, 7 or 8 years of Tiger Woods. Clearly, he's been dealing with all kinds of injuries and all kinds of surgeries. But it does also look like there's a performance coach need there. And this is me on the sidelines critiquing perhaps one of the best golfers ever. But it is quite interesting to watch somebody who is at such a high level then just literally fall off the cliff. And, again, there's injuries involved there. He's had multiple surgeries, but you have to think that the mind part, for him to be so locked in for so long and then to kind of not be locked in, it's pretty crazy to watch as an outsider.
In 2011, I had the opportunity to golf in a event where the LPGA was with us. And so we had fivesomes and every group had an LPGA player in it. And a woman told me about the performance coach she had hired, which was the same one Tiger Woods had hired. She described it as very cognitive and very thought-based. And frankly, I thought, I don't know if this is going to work.
Yeah, the feelings are all wrapped up, but it's great to go the thought direction, but you got to get the feelings direction going the right way too, huh?
Well, he had that. He used to show his frustration, and that actually helped him. And then he got a lot more decorum when he came back from. And I would submit that did not help him.
Yeah, well, you know what? We'll circle back here in the time to come, and maybe go the sports direction as your firm branches out. I think it's really interesting stuff too. Denise, is there a particular website, a URL where we can send people?
Yes, it's the Rethink Group, and it's .net.
Denise, I appreciate it. I did not expect to be on this podcast. As I watched Billions last year, I did not expect to be talking with someone who had a role in the show coming on air. So that's really cool stuff.
It was at the beginning, but
well, still, I mean, the one character clearly, influenced by you. So, and to hear your friends and associates say, "There's Denise on screen," that's kind of cool, fun stuff.
Thank you so much.
And last but not least, one of the best-selling authors of the last 15 years, Tim Ferriss. My guest today is the best-selling author of The 4-Hour Workweek, The 4-Hour Body, The 4-Hour Chef. He's otherwise known as the guy that has revolutionized the idea of writing a book, regardless of subject. Tim Ferriss has engineered the process of a bestseller. As a guy that's written 5 books that have sold nowhere near the copies that Tim has sold, I love learning. I love looking and seeing what someone else has done that I did not think about, that I did not execute. If you want to write a book, there is absolutely no one else better to learn from. Heck, even if you don't have a chance to meet him, talk to him, just observe from afar. Observe his actions. There's a second big influence that Tim Ferriss has had on my life. Location independence. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, Tim made it okay. I mean, I've always known I could be location independent, and I've done it. But Tim made it really okay that if you had your laptop, you had your cell phone, that you could work from anywhere. I mean, there's a massive movement of people around the world that have said, I've had enough of the cube, I've had enough of the desk jockey stuff, and I'm going to be anywhere. I'm one of those people. I'm always appreciative that I had a chance to be influenced in this direction. And Tim's definitely partially, if not all, responsible for the initial idea. And I'm not the only person that would say that. A ton of people would say that. Now, after all these best-selling books, Tim has a TV show coming out, The Tim Ferriss Experiment. Again, a real simple concept, and it reminds me of the Turtle Trader experiment. Basically, Tim has to learn a lot of different things really fast, few days, and the world gets to see the results. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Tim Ferriss. Hey, Tim, how are you?
I am doing very well. You're in Saigon.
Yeah, battling some kind of Southeast Asian hit you in the stomach. Man, I'm not happy. Where's the Cipro feeling right now?
Oh, man. Yeah. I've been there. I spent a week in the Calcutta ER with something like that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you feel better. Sorry to hear that.
You, sir. Here's how we came to talk today. I think you might find this somewhat fun. So we briefly met about 4 years ago at your Napa Kimono event. And so there was an opening night something another, and my friend Tim Sykes had got me to come to your event. And so afterwards, there was like people sitting down to eat, and there was a table with 2 guys, and Sykes must have known who they were. I didn't, and he motioned to sit there. And I don't think he knew them, but he knew who they were. So we sat at this table, and we sit down, and there was one guy, and he was really quiet. He didn't say a word. The other guy looks at Sykes and I and immediately says, "What the hell are you two doing with yourself? Look at you. You're out of shape. What are you eating? What are you doing to yourself?" And just lays the biggest, you're going to know, the biggest tough love thing you've ever heard from a complete stranger. Yeah. And that was how I became friends with Tucker Max.
I was going to say, it had to be Tucker. Yeah, that's trademark Tucker.
And the quiet guy was Ryan. So
yeah, that's kind of Ryan's MO. So he's like Tucker Max's Karl Rove.
Yeah, it was fun though. And it's that we became friends. So they both appeared on my podcast. So it's been cool. And that was kind of randomly how we came to talk today. But I got to tell you, here's how I prepared to talk to you today. And not just because I had read about it only, but I actually knew who he was because I grew up with 3 brothers who were wrestlers. I prepared to talk to you today by watching an hour-long Dan Gable documentary.
Ah, nice. Which one is that? The Competitor Supreme?
It was on ESPN, like a 45-minute one.
Oh, I have to find that. Yeah, that's a different one.
Yeah, it's nice. So why is Dan Gable, probably even to this day, why is Dan Gable part of your drive? And who is he? Define him for the audience.
Yeah, Dan Gable is the sportsman of the century, according to Sports Illustrated at one point. He is one of the most successful, if not the most successful, coach in the history of almost any sport in the United States. And he started as a wrestler himself. He went undefeated except for one match in his entire NCAA career. His last match, which he lost by points, and he had read the scoreboard incorrectly. That made him so upset that he trained for the Munich Olympics 7 hours a day, 7 days a week, and then won the gold medal without having a single point scored on him. That is impossible, but he did it. That is something akin to winning Wimbledon without having a point scored on you. Does not happen. And when people thought he was at the top of his game, couldn't possibly do anything to supersede that, he then proceeded to coach in Iowa and produce, 200 plus All-Americans. One, I think I'm making up these numbers, but it's like 13 Big Ten titles in a row, produced multiple Olympians. He was just the mutant factory owner, and he was so good at creating a machine of such extreme dominance that people in every other sport started to take notice, even though wrestling is typically kind of the redheaded stepchild that doesn't get any attention or appreciation. That has changed a lot with MMA, but back in the day, even when it was viewed as a very sort of secondary sport compared to all of the big team sports, Dan Gable has just been a living legend and has been ever since. So I have had him as an icon in my mind for so long. He just through serendipity ended up connecting with me, and I actually had dinner with him a few months ago, which was extremely surreal. And at one point he said to me, I could still kick your ass right now. And I was like, yes, I'm very well aware, Dan, that you could probably still almost certainly kick my ass. If you had like one arm and one leg, I think you could still kick my ass. But he is a fascinating character. And the documentary I'll have to chase down, Competitor Supreme, was basically I don't know what I would even call it, my source of inspiration and enthusiasm and aggression when I was wrestling. And even when I was an exchange student overseas in Japan and trying to learn Japanese, I would watch this I think it was sponsored by ASICS at the time, but you can probably find it online. I used this video and I watched it over and over again because it's just about kind of pushing yourself through the pain and using aggression to win your battles, and offense is the best defense and so on. And there's a post I put up later to try to give people a taste of this called Ode to Aggression, which is a blog post I wrote about Dan Gable with a clip from that, which has the great line. He's lecturing his team after a meet and he's really upset with this one guy who got a tie, and he said, "You just didn't want to lose to him before. He'd beat you twice before. And so you got a tie, and that's what you get when you just don't want to lose. You never win that way." And I was like, oh man, sage advice. So I find that.
But that grinding aspect to wrestling, and I grew up with three brothers who were wrestlers, so I wasn't in a terrible number of fights in my life. But, a lot of young guys, when they want to fight for the first time, there's a fight, they stand up and they pretend they're a boxer. I was smart enough to always go for the knees and get on the ground, at least from my minor wrestling training. But talk about the grinding aspect of wrestling and how that is played out through your career, because I think if anyone pays close attention to your career, it is a grinding. It's not like, I'm just a guy that just did this and gets all this attention. No, it's a grind. It's a slow grind of, even if I look at I tell people, they say, hey, I want to write a book, and I've written books, but they say, I want to write a book and I want to market. I say, listen, I don't know if you know who Tim Ferriss is or not, but just go look at what he's doing for writing and marketing his books and do some modeling. But talk about the grinding aspect of your career, Tim.
Well, I think that it's, there's the grinding, which is just the slow sanding down of the edge of the axe over time, and the sort of chafing off of the sort of mental and physiological and psychological equivalents of like bone spurs, which sounds really painful, and it is. And those are, I think, developed, or the stick-to-itiveness and grit of wrestling helps you to contend with scenarios that seem lost. And I think part of the reason that is, you can be losing just by a landslide in a wrestling match and pin your opponent. There is always the opportunity, unless you get tech falled, to turn it around and win the match. I think that is translated to many other areas of my life. And the 4-hour work week, for instance, was turned down by, I don't even remember how many, between 26 and 29 publishers violently. It was not the self-evident at all that the book would do anything. And it had an initial print run, I think, of 12,000 copies, and had to change the title, and all of these different things happened. And it was not a smooth takeoff. And none of the projects that I focused on that have really done well have been a smooth takeoff. It's been a lot of false starts, a lot of correcting course, a lot of last minute catastrophes that have had to be covered for. A lot of that comes from, I think, the belief, even when perhaps it's an erroneous belief, that, there's always a way to turn it around. As Thomas Edison has said, once you've looked at all of the options, just remember you haven't. And that ethos, I think, has aided me greatly. Perhaps it's delusional, but it's delusional in at least a very productive way.
Well, that slides us into today. And I can think back several years ago. I spent 3 years of my life traveling the world making a documentary film with a full crew and the whole 9 yards. And now here you are, and you've gone from a guy who's saying, okay, let's write some best-selling books. Now you're really getting the pain, making a TV show.
That's no joke. Yeah, that's no joke.
And not only the pain just from the physical stuff that you're doing, but why don't you talk about the idea of walking in? Obviously, you've had some experience at TV and production and stuff like that, but now here you are doing a show, putting yourself front and center. What are some of those initial early lessons that you start to understand about making a TV show?
Well, the first lesson I learned was you have to say no for a long time to actually get any creative control. And what I mean by that is I said no to almost every television option that came to me because I didn't have any real desire to simply have my face in more places. That wasn't interesting to me. So doing, the Real Housewife makeover of such and such county was not interesting. If I didn't have any say in what was done in the editing room, or just from the very outset, conceptually, I was not interested. And so I had Turner Broadcasting come to me at one point, and Chris, who was there at the time, asked me something I'd never been asked by a TV person, which was, if you could do anything, what would you want to do? And I said, well, that is very interesting. Number one, I would want to be an executive producer, not just a host. I would want to have these following veto powers and creative inputs so that I can protect what I've worked so hard to build. I think that I would want to do, a couple of options. First option is a show that demonstrates how far you can push accelerated learning and human performance. And the format would be me sort of testing myself to the breaking point with these world-class performers and different skills and showing the toolkit that anyone can use. Then I said the second idea would be a show about how to become Jason Bourne. And I was like, and then third, I said I would only want to do something that I would want to watch myself. And I don't watch a lot of TV, but there's one production company that made No Reservations by Anthony Bourdain, which I loved, and Mind of a Chef, which I also loved. I would want to make something gritty and cinematic like that. And we were able to do basically all three with the Tim Ferriss experiment. But what I realized, about making good TV. Wow, how deep do we want to go here? The first is take whatever time you think it's going to take and multiply it by 4. That's number one. And then if you want to make nonfiction television, you have to recognize from the very outset, and I say nonfiction instead of reality, because reality television is all bullshit. It is completely scripted. And
it's 100% scripted.
100% scripted. You know that based on just the amount of time they take to record the shows. And you also know that because you see all these weird scenes, like these big arguments in the kitchen, for instance, where people are just standing around in the kitchen and there's always one person mixing some mystery liquid. And they do that because it's easy to film, natural light. That never happens in real life. Let's face it. Like, you don't have 6 people standing in the kitchen having a debate. That's not how homes work. So to do this show, we were filming. And you've been in production, so this was beyond anything I've ever done. So not only were we filming 12 to 16 hours a day, and doing that 5 days a week typically, and having to cut that down to 22 minutes, we had to review footage I had to, as a producer, review rough cuts, send back notes, do all of this prep. Then on top of that, and this is suicidal, but we filmed probably 13 of these episodes in 16 weeks. And what that meant was we'd go just breakneck cramming with these experiments and testing and footage. And oftentimes I'm getting injured or face planting and really screwing myself up because, this, like I said, it's not a smooth takeoff. Like, learning anything in a short period of time has a lot of hiccups. we'd do that. Then Saturday would be travel day, where we'd move, a whole crew and 27 boxes of gear and blah, blah, blah to whatever our next location was. And then Sunday would be planning for Monday, and we'd start all over again. So if you want a 4-hour work week, definitely TV is not, at least in the traditional sense, not the right option.
I think sometimes, though, it's funny you mentioned that about the 4-hour work week. I think sometimes I hear people say, oh, that's all BS and this and that. And I think it's unfair, because I always looked at it like, okay, Tim is not saying exactly 4 hours. It could be 4 hours and 15 minutes, but you get the point. And the thing is, can you reduce the amount of time that you're spending, which is probably an infinite amount of extra baloney time? Can you reduce that down, get more efficient, and get freedom? Anyone that thinks that's impossible, I don't want to talk to you.
Yeah. No, and I don't run into people who've read the book who have a problem with the title, because they understand the intention, which is fundamentally, I guess, number one, I agree with what you just said, but also it's about 10xing your hourly input. Or hourly output, rather. It's about 10xing your hourly output. And once you do that, you can then choose, once you have systems and behaviors and routines in place, you can then choose what to do with your time. And whether that is cutting from 40 down to 4, whether that is doing the same number of hours, but having 10x the output, whether that's working 80 hours a week because you love what you're doing, are all fair options. But the point is you develop a high degree of leverage and optionality when you have a portfolio of techniques for time management and systems development and automating of processes and delegation of minutia, et cetera. That provides options, and options are power. So that's definitely where I land. I mean, I am type A. I love building things. I can do it. Very fortunate to be in a position where I can do whatever I want at this point. And I choose to create because I enjoy it. And trust me, I mean, you can tell people this as well, but like, if you want to make a ton of money, television also not really a great way to do it at all. I mean, most of the hosts that you see on TV, 99% of them, even very popular hosts, are making next to nothing. They're using TV as a lead generator for other things. For all of those reasons, I mean, I had to do this for kind of the love of the creation and the end product. There's no other way around it. And I mean, what I wanted to do was take the most compelling, important concepts from all 3 books, 4-Hour Workweek, 4-Hour Body, and 4-Hour Chef, for the accelerated learning piece, and kind of put them into living color in the most dramatic, compelling way possible. I think we succeeded. It was, I mean, we had to go through hell and back to do it. I mean, it was really hard on everybody, but at the end of the day, we got out what we put in, which was a lot of effort. Very fortunate to have worked with an incredible crew of folks who just made it look amazing. So very happy with it.
I've seen it said, the mantra of the new show, which is called the Tim Ferriss Experiment: you don't need to be superhuman to get superhuman results. You just need a better toolkit. Philosophically, part of your better toolkit starts with the 80-20 rule. For those that, look, a lot of my audience is going to have heard about the 80-20 rule, but why don't you explain it from your perspective, and perhaps who first turned you on to it? How far back in time do we go?
That's a good. I'm going to answer the second one first, and the short answer is I don't know. I may have come across writing by Richard. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, so I won't massacre it. Koch. There are a lot of ways to go there. I'll say Koch, who did a lot of writing on the 80-20 principle, but I think it came well before that, and actually being turned on to Vilfredo Pareto, the originator of Pareto's law, which is commonly known as the 80-20 principle, probably through college in economics, or perhaps even sociology. But the general principle is pretty simple. So Vilfredo Pareto, who was, I believe he's a Swiss-Italian economist / sociologist, noticed that the distribution of wealth was very asymmetrical. You notice that something like 80% of the land, or 90% of the land, and I think Switzerland was owned by less than 20% of the population. He also noticed, though, that this applied to, for instance, his garden, where 20% of the pea plants produced 80% of the pods and peas. And he began to look for this type of disproportionate output for a lesser input in all sorts of different areas. And the way that I apply this, or many people apply this now to different areas, would be, say, looking at your customer or product mix if you're an entrepreneur, for instance. So what are the 20% of customers that produce 80% or more of your revenue or your profit? You can use this in the opposite, or I should say conversely also. So who are the 20% of customers that consume 80% or more of your time? And the fascinating part is when you do a comparison like that, you don't find a lot of overlap. The customers who tend to be the most promising are also the lower maintenance customers, oftentimes, not always. This can be applied to your life on a more personal basis and I do this whenever I'm feeling overwhelmed in any capacity or over anxious. In 80-20 analysis, where I will look at what are the 20% of activities, commitments, people in my life who are producing 80% or more of my negative emotions, anxiety, anger, etc. I use that as a lens through which I view almost anything that I'm doing or experiencing. And it's very helpful. I typically do it with a pad of paper and a pen. It does not require anything high tech, does not require wearing a Jawbone or some fancy self-tracking device. It's a very simple but elegant exercise.
I want to offer one. I know you've got the first season filmed, but my second book was a story about a very famous trader who took students, young people in their early 20s that answered want ads in the Wall Street Journal in the early 1980s. And he had made $200 million by the age of 37. He put these ads in the paper. These students responded. He gave them 2 weeks of training, set them off on their own down the street in Chicago from his main office. 4 years later, the group of 20 students selected had made about $100 million profit. 25 years later, 6 of them are still trading for clients. If at some point in time, Mr. Ferris, if you want some introductions to people that might have fun trying to train you in trading, I can give you more than one. That's for sure.
That is a fascinating offer. Let me ruminate on that. I mean, these sandboxes are all interesting to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was looking at your list. I was like, okay, trading is going to be in this list at some point in time. And I was thinking, well, even on the second season, maybe he's even got ideas already. Listen, parkour. I mean, I guess I've seen the pictures and the images of it, but this is insane. You've seriously, there's a slightly screw loose that you're even attempting that, isn't there?
Oh, 100%. 100%. And in retrospect, that was a lot of these episodes had an element of danger. I mean, surfing with Laird Hamilton, undisputed king of big wave surfing, was one. The rally car racing, I mean, where you're flying down roads that are oftentimes literally 8 to 12 feet wide with trees and rocks on the sides. Those were all dangerous. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I think I broke one of my floating ribs doing that during that episode. But the parkour was by far the most dangerous, and I suffered some tremendous injuries. And for people who aren't familiar with parkour, maybe you've seen American Ninja Warrior or Ninja Warrior. It's basically like taking the skills of a ninja, an acrobat, and a break dancer and trying to use them as you jump from like building to building, and effectively the chase scene in Casino Royale at the very beginning, if anyone has seen that, or District 9. Yes, I suffered some pretty catastrophic injuries that are captured on camera. What a lot of people don't realize, because it ended up being finished and edited much later, was the first episode that we shot. So I had so many injuries carrying through this entire season. It was unbelievable. But yes, parkour, probably a little too aggressive in terms of selection, because it's so heavily attribute dependent. You can't just have a theoretical understanding of these things. You have to have connective tissue and so on that can accommodate the impact forces and so on that you're dealing with. So I, in retrospect, probably shouldn't have done parkour. Certainly shouldn't have done it as the first episode, but live and learn, as they say. I don't
ask this from a kind of a weird curiosity, but guys, we're talking about the physical stuff. You're in your 30s, right?
I am 37.
Okay, so in late 30s, you start to feel the recovery time starts to appear, at least for me, starts to appear. I'm in my mid 40s. It starts to appear in your late 30s. I think that recovery time, I think it's why all the baseball players wanted to take steroids in the steroid ages for recovery. But talk about some of that. Give some advice to the audience, because there's a lot of guys in my audience and some very successful ones. But talk about the idea of getting older in recovery and athletics, Give some good tips. You've done the homework. You know the insights.
I have done homework. Yeah, so there are a few things I would say. Number one is the best way to get injured as an aging male, if you sit down a lot in particular, is to try to go to a track and run because you're taking your hamstrings to the extreme end range of the movement. You're going to pull a hamstring, and that's a very bad injury. It takes a long time to heal typically. So the first recommendation I would make if you're trying to mitigate injury and maintain some degree of athletic performance and recovery is, number one, have a mobility practice of some type. And Kelly Starrett is a great person to follow with this. He is Mobility WOD, W-O-D. That's his company. Have a basic, 10 to 15 minute mobility practice that you use to effectively test and test your joints and expand your functional range of movement. This is not the same as stretching necessarily. And I think that for older guys who try to hold stretches too long every day or every other day, that is one of the primary causes of being as stiff as they are. They're actually holding stretches too long. So going to a comfortable end range of movement and then coming out of that position repeatedly, I think does more oftentimes than holding a 60-second stretch where you end up doing causing a lot of micro trauma. The second thing I would say is you have to ensure your nutrition is on point. And a very simple first step is making sure that you consume 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up. And 30 grams of protein could be, say, 3 or 4 hard-boiled eggs and some lentils out of a can. If you're lazy like I am, hard-boiled eggs and some lentils out of a can. Or it could be, say, a whey protein isolate if you're taking a shake. Now, the shake isn't ideal just because whey protein, for instance, is basically the simple sugar of proteins. It will spike your insulin levels. But you could consume, say, a tablespoon or 2 of coconut oil before you have it, and that will blunt your insulin response a little bit. So those would be 2 suggestions right off the bat. And I would say consider, if you have never done this, if you're suffering from older injuries or lingering chronic injuries, consider something called active release technique, ART, which is a form of myofascial release that effectively removes adherences between adjacent muscle tissue for the most part. I mean, there are other types, but that is also something as like a creaky dude that, or a woman for that matter, but guys tend to be more belligerent with themselves and have less self-preservation. So we end up with a lot more scar tissue because we're just retarded. So I would say those would be a couple of recommendations right off the bat.
Obviously your passion right now is the new show and creating everything and getting out and talking about it. But your real passion is where I just asked, because clearly I just wound you up for a second and I could see you could have gone for hours in that direction.
Yeah, I think about this stuff all the time. So, and the physical stuff, I mean, is a big component of everything that I do. I mean, if you're writing a 500-page book, and you have a tight deadline, you need to manage your physical machine very, very carefully. I mean, because there are limits to which you can replenish, for instance, neurotransmitters on a short time turnaround. So how do you supplement to facilitate that if you have to cram? If you are trying to, for instance, learn a language in 3 or 4 days, well enough to do a 6-minute interview on live television in Filipino, which is one of the episodes, you have sort of biochemical substrates in your brain that you will deplete, just as you would deplete glycogen in your liver or your muscles from doing a very long bike ride. And you have to manage all of that. So these are things that are not separate from the mind. I think that physical and mental are separated oftentimes, but the systems upon which both of those depend are the same. For mental performance, the coconut oil that I mentioned, for instance, gets converted into, the MCTs, the medium chain triglycerides, get converted into ketones very readily by the liver. So if you're doing what I'm doing right now, which is consuming very few carbohydrates, so I'm in a state of ketosis, I can have a cup of tea with a tablespoon of coconut oil melted into it, and I feel like I've had 3 cups of coffee. It's a hell of a trick. So these are also a lot of, that's part of the portfolio of techniques that goes into all the episodes in the show as well. And I have a lot of bonus footage that I'm going to share that relates to the recovery and like what my suitcase contains. I had an entire suitcase just for recovery stuff. So I go through that in some of the bonus videos.
I will definitely be. I'll be watching the recovery stuff. I'm struggling with it these days. Hey, Tim, I can't keep you. We got to run. I want to let everybody know the particulars. The show, The Tim Ferriss Experiment, will be premiering.
It would be April 28th. So by the time people hear this, we should have not just one, but every episode of the show up House of Cards style on iTunes. So I'm putting everything out at once, and you can pick and choose. You can get the whole season for like 50% off, which of course would be my hope that you watch them all. If you go to itunes.com/Tim Ferriss with 2 R's and 2 S's, you should be able to find it. And then for links to all that stuff, as well as bonus footage from the show that got cut and interviews, extended interviews, people can go to 4hourworkweek.com/TV, all spelled out, FOUR, 4hourworkweek.com/TV.
Tim, at some point in time in the future, when you're having a rest, I want to have you on just to talk long form about recovery, just recovery.
Yeah,
I think you could go well there. Hey, listen, man, I appreciate you taking the time today, and hopefully we can catch up in the future.
I appreciate you having me on, and once I recover from the TV show, I'll have a whole new set of notes to share with you.
Thanks, Tim. Take care, man.
All right, have a good one. Bye-bye.
Take care. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.